Hello and welcome to Firstpost. You're watching Vantage with me, Alison Lagrange. Kenya remains our top focus. We told you about the violent protests on Tuesday. Well, the president has spoken out. He's called yesterday's events treasonous. He has also deployed the military to contain the violence. So, no signs of a concession from the government. What does this mean for Kenya's immediate future? Will the violence continue over the coming days? And if so, how will it affect the neighborhood? We'll bring a comprehensive report on these questions. Meanwhile, Pakistan has launched a new campaign to flush out terrorists. We'll tell you why it is a sham. The Kremlin says it will host Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi next month. We'll decode the significance of the visit. Is Israel using Indian weapons in Gaza? A new report is making waves. How the fight for the Speaker's post in India's parliament led to disruptions. And finally, why Indians are not exercising enough. A special report coming up ahead. But first, the headlines. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan accuses Western powers of backing alleged Israeli plans to attack Lebanon and spread war throughout the region. Erdogan's remarks come amid ongoing cross-border exchanges of fire between Israeli forces and Lebanon's Iran-backed Hezbollah. The Kremlin dismisses arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court for its former defense minister Sergei Shoigu and the army chief. Moscow calls the move absurd and lacking legal force. Last year, the ICC had issued an arrest warrant for President Vladimir Putin. Russia is not a member of the ICC. Violence in Myanmar continues. An ethnic armed group clashed with the junta troops for the second consecutive day in the northern Shan state. Now, the rebels targeted military positions in a strategic town which sits on a vital trade route to China. It's the latest breach of a China-brokered ceasefire that ended weeks of fighting in the Shan state. The United States House of Representatives votes in favor of an impartial investigation into Pakistan's general elections held in February this year. The resolution condemns attempts to suppress the people of Pakistan's participation in their democracy. The United States, Britain, and the European Union have all expressed concerns about Pakistan's electoral process. Cash-strapped Sri Lanka clinches a restructuring deal with key bilateral lenders. It covers up to $5.8 billion in debt, but it does not include Colombo's single largest bilateral lender, China. In 2022, Sri Lanka defaulted on its foreign debt after running out of foreign exchange. And South African scientists inject radioactive material into live rhino horns to make them easier to detect at border posts. This is a pioneering project aimed at curbing poaching. South Africa is home to a large majority of the world's rhinos. It is also a hotspot for poaching driven by demand from Asia. We start with Kenya. A proposed tax hike had plunged the country into violence. Thousands of people were protesting. The parliament had been breached, and the streets were littered with dead bodies. The pictures were truly scary, and it's had the intended effect. Because President William Ruto has made a U-turn. He says he is withdrawing the new proposals. Listen in.
Consequently, having reflected on the continuing conversation around the content of the Finance Bill 2024, and listening keenly to the people of Kenya, who have said loudly that they want nothing to do with this Finance Bill 2024, I concede, and therefore I will not sign the 2024 Finance Bill, and it shall subsequently be withdrawn, and I have agreed with these members.
Talk about a triumph of the people. Ruto had himself proposed these higher taxes. They were part of a new finance bill. He had remained defiant until now. Ruto was using very different language yesterday. He had called the protests treasonous. He accused organized criminals of hijacking it. But now he has made a U-turn. Let me show you what happened overnight. First, the parliament was breached. Young Kenyans had promised to occupy the National Assembly. On Tuesday, they actually did it. It was the same across Kenya. Protesters were out in full force against the government. Look at these scenes in Mombasa. The military used tear gas to repel the protesters. The protesters responded by throwing stones. Even Ruto's hometown was affected. Protesters there burned vehicles and buildings. Take a look. As the protests spread, the military was called in. Then the crackdown began. It was a brutal military operation. Soldiers fired live rounds at the protesters. Last we checked, around 23 of them had been killed. Plus hundreds have been injured. The streets of Nairobi almost resembled a war zone. You could see smoke rising from the tear gas, also the deafening sound of gunfire. Some videos showed dead bodies lying on the streets. A violent 24 hours for Kenya. So tonight we are focusing on two questions. What led to this violence? And what happens next? The cause is a proposed tax hike. Kenya's foreign debt has increased to 70% of its GDP. The country is also getting help from the IMF. But as you know, the IMF has strict conditions. They want Ruto to increase government revenue. How? By hiking taxes. The first proposal included hikes across the board, even for things like fuel, diapers and bread. But when people started protesting, some of those proposals were dropped. Yet the protests continued. Kenya is already struggling with a cost of living crisis. Their inflation is around 12.2%. So these tax hikes would have made things worse. Hence the protests. Most of these demonstrators were young Kenyans. They organized on social media, even live streamed their protests and rallies. At first, Ruto said he was proud of them, but after Tuesday's violence, he had sharpened his tone. He said criminal gangs had hijacked the protests.
I am very proud of our young people. They have stepped forward tribeless. They have stepped forward peaceful. And I want to tell them we are going to engage them.
An otherwise legitimate expression of the fundamental rights and freedoms of assembly, demonstration, picketing, and petitioning of public authorities by a section of law-abiding citizens of the Republic of Kenya was infiltrated and hijacked by a group of organized criminals.
Which brings us to the second question. What happens next? Well, the violence has largely ended. The military has been deployed across the capital. They are standing guard outside the parliament. Now that Ruto has withdrawn the bill, things should be peaceful. It's a relief for the whole region. You see, Kenya is located in a politically volatile part of Africa, the continent's eastern part. You have Somalia, Uganda, South Sudan, and Ethiopia, countries that face immense political turmoil. But Kenya has been different. It has been the beacon of stability in East Africa. Kenya makes up 40% of the region's GDP. It's like the gateway to Africa. The port of Mombasa, for example, is among the biggest in Africa. Many multinational companies have their regional headquarters in Kenya. Plus, it's a key ally of the US. So Kenya's domestic politics has implications for the world. Washington is keeping a close eye on the protests. They have also criticized the violence.
We condemn the violence reported during protests in Nairobi and around Kenya. We mourn the loss of life and injuries sustained and offer our condolences to the families who lost loved ones. We urge restraint to restore order and provide space for dialogue.
The US has a lot at stake. Last month, Joe Biden laid out the red carpet for Ruto. He hosted him for a state visit. And weeks later, this happens. Even India will be watching things closely. Around 20,000 Indian citizens live in Kenya. They have given an advisory by the Indian diplomatic mission: exercise caution, restrict non-essential movement, and avoid areas affected by protests. The people of Kenya have certainly won this round, but the trouble doesn't end here. Ruto is keen to administer the bitter pill. He may find other ways to do it. Those were the latest updates from Kenya. That was the ground situation. But how did it come to this? Why did the government allow public anger to reach this level? Why did they insist on raising taxes? Despite the obvious opposition from the common people, to put it simply, the government believes it had no choice. It is drowning in a sea of debt, and it is desperate for a lifeline, which is why it resorted to raising taxes. Part of Kenya's debt problem is the government's fault, caused by unchecked borrowing over the last decade. But there's more to the story. You have international lenders tightening the screws, like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. You also have external shocks like COVID and the war in Ukraine, leading to Kenya's currency depreciating. And of course, there's usually one suspicious party when it comes to debt, especially debt in Africa. We're talking about China. Beijing is also to blame for Kenya's debt problems. Our next report brings you the details.
The situation in Kenya is the direct result of unsustainable debt. Nairobi owes a lot of money to a lot of different creditors, both internal and external. How much does Kenya owe in total? About 11.2 trillion Kenyan shillings, or almost $86 billion at today's exchange rate. That's the total debt. It's about 68% of the country's GDP. That is far above recommended levels, meaning that Kenya could default on this debt. And that is also why the government is desperate to raise taxes. It needs the extra revenue to repay its loans. Let's put internal loans aside for a moment. They aren't as dangerous to Kenya in the current situation. The bigger issue is external debt. Here are some examples of the external lenders: the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the African Development Bank, and of course, nations that lent bilaterally, like China. But they didn't lend the money in shillings. It was primarily in US dollars. And that is where the problems arose, because the last few years have seen Kenya's currency tank. In 2023, the shilling was in a free fall. It shed 26.8% of its value against the US dollar. That meant that Kenya's debt burden kept rising without it having borrowed too much money. Kenya's debt rose by more than $13 billion last year. And about 73% of this was due to the falling currency. That's almost $10 billion of extra debt. That is why Kenya's government is insisting on raising taxes, in case the shilling goes into a free fall again. The Ruto government is desperate to avoid a debt default. Look at Sri Lanka in 2022, or Ghana that same year, or Zambia in 2020. Now, what happens if a country fails to pay back a loan? First, it becomes harder to get a new one. Then the value of the defaulting nation's currency usually tanks, making imports more expensive, causing inflation to surge. Then there are usually shortages of essential goods, leading to hoarding, long lines, and public inconvenience. Kenya is already suffering from a weak shilling and high inflation. To avoid the rest of the problems, the government had to pay back its loans. A big Eurobond payment was due this year, worth about $2 billion. Kenya didn't have the money to pay it back, so it borrowed more money, and that too at a higher interest rate. Now you would wonder, if the big loan repayment was made, why is Kenya raising taxes now? Well, that's just one out of many repayments. Here's the list for the next financial year. About $660 million to the World Bank, about $650 million to the African Development Bank, $110 million to the IMF, but the biggest loan shark in the next fiscal is China. Kenya has to pay China $1.2 billion by the end of June 2025. And Beijing isn't known to be very flexible with its repayment schedule. That is why the Kenyan government under President William Ruto is desperate for more tax revenue. Last year, the IMF had described Kenya as an innocent bystander during the world's debt shock. Nairobi could not have predicted the COVID pandemic, or the war in Ukraine, or the resultant inflation and high interest rates in the US. All these factors caused Kenya's currency to tank, and its debt to spiral out of control, leading to the crisis that you see today.
Pakistan has launched a nationwide anti-terror campaign. It's called Operation Azm-e-Ishtikam. The word itself is Urdu. It translates to Resolve for Stability. Now, such operations are not new. This is Pakistan's 12th anti-terror campaign since 2007. But will it work? Let's look at the strategy first. The operation was approved by Pakistan's government this week. It focuses mainly on the TTP, that's the Pakistani Taliban. And how will the government fight them? Now, there are 4 broad methods. The first is military operations to flush them out, your typical counter-terror ops. The second is roping in multiple law enforcement agencies. The idea is to make sure terror suspects are prosecuted and convicted, something that rarely happens in Pakistan. Most suspects end up acquitted or in safe houses. Now, the third strategy is socio-economic, tackling issues like poverty that lead to extremist ideology. And finally, the fourth strategy, an information offensive. Extremist ideology is rampant on the internet, so Pakistan wants to combat that. They want to push messages of national unity and harmony. Now, this plan did trigger some pushback. It was framed as a nationwide military operation. So the opposition asked, why weren't they consulted? Why wasn't the parliament roped in? But the government says it's not necessary, because this operation is not new per se. It's a renewal of existing campaigns. But why has Pakistan launched it? This is a country that has traditionally used terrorism as state policy. So why the change of heart? Because Pakistan is now the victim. Almost 800 terror attacks were reported in 2023. Put together, they claimed more than 1,500 lives. They have also left 1,400 people injured. It's a 6-year high for terror attacks in Pakistan. So the government was under pressure to act. China, too, was pushing Islamabad. Beijing is investing around $60 billion in Pakistan, but that money is under threat. Chinese assets and citizens are being attacked by terrorists. One such incident was in March of this year. A suicide bombing killed 5 Chinese workers in northwest Pakistan, so Beijing wanted Islamabad to crack down. But will this operation be able to do that? There are a couple of problems. First is the lack of global support. Pakistan has raised this issue at multilateral forums like the UN, but the response has been lukewarm. Countries are wary of what Pakistan says. Secondly, flushing out the terrorists won't be easy. The TTP is strong in 2 provinces. Both of them share a border with Afghanistan. The Taliban in Kabul support the TTP. They give them weapons and safe havens. So if Pakistan comes hunting, they can simply cross the border. In some cases, even that may not be necessary because Pakistan's army is unpopular in these 2 provinces. So the locals will not be eager to help them. Then what's the point of this operation? It's mostly about optics. Pakistan is wooing investors from the Gulf. The likes of Saudi Arabia and the UAE have promised funds, but all of them want security. So Pakistan cannot be seen as doing nothing, which is why this campaign has been launched. But if Islamabad is serious about it, they should target all terrorists, not just the ones attacking them. Meanwhile, Moscow is gearing up to welcome a special guest, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Reports say he'll travel to Russia next month. The visit would be significant for more than one reason. It will be Prime Minister Modi's first trip to Russia in nearly 5 years, and his first one since Russia invaded Ukraine. The trip also comes ahead of the BRICS summit, which Russia is all set to host later this year. So what is on the agenda, and how will this trip shape the India-Russia relationship? Our next report brings you the details.
There is a buzz within the Russian press. They are discussing Russia's ties with India and seeking opinions from experts, decoding every aspect of the relationship. The reason is a comment from the Kremlin. This week, a spokesperson confirmed that preparations are underway in Moscow to welcome the Indian Prime Minister. New Delhi hasn't confirmed any specifics just as yet, but reports say that PM Modi will travel to Russia in July. The significance of the trip isn't lost on anyone. Since 2000, India and Russia have held annual summits. Top leaders from both countries have hosted each other alternatively to review this vital partnership. But in recent years, this practice has stalled. The Indian Prime Minister's last visit to Russia was in 2019. There was a pause in 2020 due to the pandemic. In 2021, Vladimir Putin made a brief trip to India. So PM Modi is due for a return visit. It would be his first visit since the invasion of Ukraine. The trip comes at a crucial time. India would be sending important signals with this engagement. The first one is a reaffirmation of friendship with Russia. The visit to Russia would be PM Modi's first bilateral engagement in his 3rd term. In the past, India's neighbourhood has been given priority. In 2014, PM Modi chose Bhutan and Nepal for his first bilaterals. In 2019, he travelled to the Maldives and Sri Lanka. This time, his choice is Russia. It underscores his commitment to this relationship. The second signal is continuity. For decades, Russia has been a key defence partner for India. During the visit, India and Russia could sign a defence logistics pact. Moscow has already approved the agreement's draft. It will facilitate deeper military engagements between both sides. The pact would enable more military drills, trainings, port calls, and even disaster relief efforts. The third and possibly most important signal would be to China. After the Ukraine war, Western sanctions have driven Russia to deepen ties with China. In May, Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Russia. Both leaders used the occasion to reaffirm their no-limits partnership. Back in New Delhi, these pictures led to concerns in some circles. But for Russia, India still remains a vital partner. Moscow demonstrated this in December last year when President Putin hosted India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar at the Kremlin. Usually, this honor is reserved for heads of state. But for Putin, this was an opportunity to showcase the importance he places on relations with India.
Of course, we will be glad to see our friend, Mr. Prime Minister Modi, in Russia. We have a lot of work to do. So I ask you to convey to him my best wishes, and please pass on our invitation. We are waiting for him in Russia.
First of all, please allow me to convey the personal greetings of Prime Minister Modi. He has also, through me, sent a letter to you. Certainly, Mr. President, he looks forward to visiting Russia next year.
That opportunity may have finally arrived. A visit allows the Indian Prime Minister to underscore India's strong partnership with Russia and provide a much-needed counterbalance to China.
Now let's talk about Israel's war in Gaza. More specifically, how Israel has been arming itself. For decades, the US has been Israel's biggest military backer, and that's unlikely to change anytime soon. But Israel could be investing in other defense partners. One of them could be India. A new report has come out. It makes a significant claim. The report says Israel got access to Indian weapons, stuff like rockets and rocket engines, explosives and propellant for cannons. Apparently, these weapons were transferred from India to Israel during this war. These supplies were shipped back in April. Such claims have been made before as well. Earlier this month, an Israeli diplomat gave an interview. His name is Daniel Carmen. Now, he has served as Israel's ambassador to India from 2014 to 2018. Ambassador Carmen spoke about these reports. He said, and I quote, "The Indians always remind us that Israel was there for them during the Kargil War. Israel was one of the few countries that stood by them and provided them with weapons. The Indians don't forget this and might now be returning the favor." So what is the backstory here? Let's try to connect the dots. Back in May, Spain turned away a ship. It wanted to dock at a Spanish port, but it was denied permission. The ship had the flag of Denmark, and reports say it began its journey from India's Chennai. The ship was headed to Israel's Haifa port. It wanted to make a stop at Spain's Cartagena port, presumably for restocking and refueling. But Madrid refused to welcome the ship. And they said the ship had 27 tons of explosives, so it wasn't allowed to dock in Spain. Spain has been a fierce critic of Israel's war. This is mainly due to the rising civilian casualties. In response, it has suspended arms export licenses to Israel. It has also extended support to Palestinians. Recently, Spain joined the European states and recognized the state of Palestine. So that's the position of Spain. It is against the war, and it wants the hostilities to end. There was another claim that made waves this year. It was in the form of a video. We had showed you this clip earlier on this show. Allegedly, this was recorded in Gaza. It came out right after a refugee camp was bombed. These are believed to be remains of a missile. Apparently, this was dropped by Israeli warplanes. There is a label on it which reads, "Made in India." This video was widely distributed by pro-Palestinian social media accounts. We haven't been able to independently verify it, but this story has taken on a life of its own. There are multiple versions, including this one. It came out last month. It says third-party vendors are probably supplying arms to Israel. On its part, New Delhi has stuck to its position. It condemns the terror attack by the Hamas, but it wants the hostilities to end. India backs a two-state solution to this conflict. This month, at a meeting of BRICS foreign ministers, India has signed off on a firm joint statement. It refers to the Israeli operation in Rafah as an occupation. It also is worth considering history here. Defense ties have shaped the India-Israel relationship, and this has been an important partnership for New Delhi. For years, Israel has been more willing to share advanced defense technology and know-how with India. New Delhi recognized Israel in 1950, but diplomatic ties were established only in 1992. Israel's military support to India predates that. Israel helped India during the 1971 war, which led to the liberation of Bangladesh. Israel had secretly provided weapons and instructors to India. Then, in 1999, when Pakistan's soldiers infiltrated India at Kargil, Israel came to India's aid again. It transferred sophisticated weapons to India. So the relationship runs deep. But over the years, it hasn't influenced India's overall approach to the Palestine issue. And judging by India's recent statements on the war, that still seems to be the case. It was a busy day in India's parliament. All eyes were on the Speaker's chair. Who would preside over the 18th Lok Sabha? Well, it's a familiar name. Om Birla has been elected as the Speaker, but not before some drama. Usually, the Speaker is chosen based on consensus, meaning the opposition supports the government's choice. But not this time. The opposition laid out a condition. If you want our support, give us the position of Deputy Speaker. Again, this is parliamentary tradition. The Speaker belongs to the ruling party, the Deputy Speaker belongs to the opposition. But this time, the government said no, so the opposition proposed their own pick for Speaker. The elections happened today. A voice vote was held for the Speaker's position, and Om Birla won it. The opposition could have pushed for a division of votes, but they decided against it. Afterwards, the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition escorted Birla to the Speaker's chair.
आपके चेयर है, आप संभालें प्लीज।
That's another big development. Rahul Gandhi is now leader of the opposition. The post has been lying vacant for 10 years. You need at least 10% seats in parliament to become the leader of the opposition. In 2014 and 2019, the Congress did not have that. But this time, they do. Last night, the party unanimously chose Gandhi to become their leader. It's Rahul Gandhi's first constitutional position, one that his mother and father also occupied. Now, coming back to the Speaker, both Prime Minister Modi and Rahul Gandhi congratulated him, but their messages were different. Listen to this.
17वीं लोकसभा उसकी प्रोडक्टिविटी 25 साल के हाईएस्ट लेवल पर 97% रही और इसके लिए सब माननीय सदस्य तो अभिनंदन के अधिकारी हैं, लेकिन आप विशेष अभिनंदन के अधिकारी हैं।
The question is not how efficiently the House is run. The question is how much of India's voice is being allowed to be heard in this House. So the idea, Speaker Sir, so the idea that you can run the House efficiently by silencing the voice of the opposition is a non-democratic idea.
हम सबकी आपसे अपेक्षा है कि किसी भी जनप्रतिनिधि की आवाज़ दबाई न जाए और ना ही निष्कासन जैसी कार्रवाई दोबारा सदन की गरिमा को ठेस पहुंचाएं। आपका अंकुश विपक्ष पे तो रहता ही है, लेकिन आपका अंकुश सत्ता पक्ष पे भी रहे।
Umberla has a dubious record. He disqualified almost 100 MPs in his last term, hence these demands by the opposition. And what about the Deputy Speaker? Well, there's no clarity on that. The government is yet to convey its position to the opposition. As for the process, it's the same. The Deputy Speaker is also elected from the MPs. In the Lok Sabha, this post lay vacant. But with a stronger performance in the recent elections, the opposition is gunning for it. After his election, Umberla spoke to the MPs. He raised the emergency of 1975. The opposition raised objections to it, and afterwards the House was adjourned.
ये सदन 1975 में देश में आपातकाल इमरजेंसी लगाने के निर्णय की कड़े शब्दों में निंदा करता है। इसके साथ ही 25 जून 1975 के उस दिन को हम हमेशा काले अध्याय के रूप में जाना जाएगा। इस दिन तत्कालीन प्रधानमंत्री श्रीमती इंदिरा गांधी ने देश में इमरजेंसी लगाई और बाबा साहब अम्बेडकर द्वारा निर्मित संविधान पर प्रचंड प्रहार किया था। सरकार के हाथों अपनी जान गंवाने वाले भारत के ऐसे कर्तव्यनिष्ठ और देश में प्रेम करने वाले नागरिकों की स्मृति में हम सब 2 मिनट का मौन रखते हैं।
In many ways, this was a sneak peek. The opposition has a lot more MPs now, so they are making their presence felt in Parliament. But the government is signalling the opposite, that majority or not, things won't change. This could mean a lot more confrontations and disruptions in Parliament. Now let's turn our attention to North Korea. This morning, the Hermit Kingdom launched a missile. Normally, this wouldn't be big news. Pyongyang launches missiles all the time. But today, it was reportedly a hypersonic missile test. A missile that travels more than 5 times faster than the speed of sound. The test was reportedly a failure. The missile exploded mid-flight. But this was still a warning by Pyongyang. North Korea is protesting against military drills being held in the south. Joint air drills by South Korea and the US. The drills began today, days after an American aircraft carrier arrived in South Korea. So today's hypersonic test was one way North Korea showed its displeasure. That isn't the only way Pyongyang has displayed its annoyance, though. It has also released more balloons into South Korea. Balloons filled with trash and human feces. Here's our report.
It was 5:30 a.m. local time in Korea. That's when the North decided to start the day with a good old-fashioned scare tactic. Pyongyang fired a missile towards its eastern waters. And not an ordinary missile. North Korea had an early morning test of a hypersonic rocket. Hypersonic missile technology is still up and coming. This is when a missile travels faster than Mach 5. That's 5 times faster than the speed of sound. These missiles are supposed to be both fast and maneuverable. They don't travel along a straight path. They can change directions at high speeds, making them a potent weapon against enemy missile defense systems. Of course, this is when hypersonic missiles actually work. Only a few countries have perfected them, like Russia, China, and Iran. North Korea is friendly with all 3 nations, but it hasn't caught up with them in the hypersonic race. Today's launch was evidence of that. North Korea's missile crashed and burned. Unintentionally, that is. The launch was a damp squib. Reports say that there could have been engine trouble. There was a lot of smoke generated at launch, and the missile crumbled as it approached the ocean. But despite the missile test failure, North Korea succeeded in its real mission. which was to alarm South Korea and the US. The two allies began joint air drills today. American F-16s flew alongside South Korean F-35s. This is a small teaser for what's to come over the next few weeks. It's part of the larger Freedom Edge exercise.
The goal of Freedom Edge is it is a trilateral exercise between the United States Navy, the ROC Navy, and the JMSDF. And the intent of it is to improve the tactical proficiency of our ships. The intent is to improve the interoperability between our navies. And the intent is to ensure that we are ready to respond to any crisis or contingency.
The military exercise will expand to include Japan. And they'll involve everything from stealth fighter to aircraft carrier drills. The Americans are all geared up. They've brought the USS Theodore Roosevelt to South Korea. It docked in Busan on Saturday, and even got a warm welcome from South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol.
Trilateral cooperation between South Korea, United States and Japan, who share the values of liberal democracy, will be another strong deterrence along with South Korea-United States alliance.
So obviously North Korea isn't thrilled about this, which explains their missile mishap this morning. And the resumption of a troubling tactic, trash balloon warfare. Pyongyang is at it again. It is sending balloons across the border, balloons carrying trash and human feces. Today, these balloons briefly disrupted an airport. The runways were shut for 3 hours at the international airport in Incheon. North Korean balloons arrived there late at night, and airport staff had to sweep up the trash before operations could resume. Now, this trashy tactic isn't the most dangerous North Korean stunt, but tensions are ramping up in the Korean peninsula. And South Korea's joint drills with Japan and the US are sure to draw Pyongyang's ire.
Our next story is about Justin Trudeau. Things aren't going too well for his party. Trudeau's Liberals went to sleep expecting a win in a safe seat, but instead they woke up to a shocking loss. The Liberals were defeated in a Toronto by-election, losing a seat they have held for 30 years. It was won by the Conservatives. This has now raised doubts about Trudeau's leadership. A new poll says 68% of Canadians want him to step down. So can Trudeau lead the Liberals for the next election, or is it the end of the road for the Canadian Prime Minister? Our next report tells you.
This is St. Paul's, an electoral district in Toronto. It has a population of 300,000. Since 1993, Canada's Liberal Party has held this seat. St. Paul's was considered a Liberal stronghold, but not anymore. There was a by-election for the seat on Tuesday, and the Conservatives have won it. Conservative candidate Don Stewart won the closely watched election. He got 42% of the vote. 15,555 ballots were cast for him. Meanwhile, Liberal candidate Leslie Church won 40.5% of the votes, and he got around 14,965 votes. So the difference is about 500 votes. But that doesn't matter. This is the first time the Conservatives have won this seat in 3 decades. It's a huge shock for the Liberals. They woke up to a loss in a safe seat. And not just safe, St. Paul's was the safest of safe seats. Which brings us to Toronto itself. For Liberals, it's often Fortress Toronto. These are urban seats that they always win, even during their worst lows. Conservatives rarely ever win seats in Toronto. But the St. Paul's by-election has changed everything. And Trudeau agrees. If the Conservatives can win in Toronto, they can win anywhere. So it's a wake-up call for the Canadian Prime Minister. Justin Trudeau has led Canada since 2015. This is his 3rd term in office. But in the last year, he has seen a significant drop in support. That's because of a number of issues. Canada is dealing with a cost of living crisis. Economic growth is slow. Homes are unaffordable. There's growing unemployment, crimes are on the rise, and cities are dealing with rampant drug use. All of this is impacting Trudeau's popularity. His approval ratings are at a record low of 28%. A recent poll suggests 68% Canadians want him to step down. Now, Trudeau is not obliged to call an election until 2025, but there are rumblings inside his party, and it's been going on for some time. Liberals have debated if he should lead the party again in polls, or if he should be replaced. Till this by-election, that chatter was muted. It was mostly happening in closed rooms. Now it's likely to be out in the open. However, the Liberals cannot remove Trudeau even if they want to. But the pressure will be on the Canadian Prime Minister. Plus, cracks inside the party could make governing difficult for him. So what will it be for Justin Trudeau? Can he lead Canada for a record 4th term? It hasn't happened in the country since 1908. Or are Trudeau's Liberals on course for their worst defeat in history? We'll find out by next year.
Moving on to our next story. This one is about Foxconn, the company that manufactures iPhones. It has been accused of discriminatory practices in India. A new Reuters report suggests that Foxconn rejects married women for jobs at their iPhone plant in Tamil Nadu. Not just that, hiring agencies too are asked to avoid recruiting married women. Now, Foxconn has denied any such report. It says it doesn't discriminate on the basis of marital status. But it has raised questions about recruitment practices in India. Our next report tells you more.
Just an hour's drive from Chennai lies Sriperumbudur. It's an industrial town in the southern Indian state of Tamil Nadu. Sriperumbudur hosts many manufacturing facilities, but one of the biggest is that of Foxconn. It's a key manufacturer of Apple devices. This factory is its main iPhone assembly plant in India. But what we did not know is that it also doubles as a time machine. Once you step in, you're transported back in time, to an era where married women were rejected for jobs. This is what a Reuters investigation claims. It's found that Foxconn has discriminatory hiring practices. It avoids hiring married women. If they apply for jobs, they are mostly rejected. Hiring agencies too have been asked to avoid recruiting married women. But why is that? According to reports, Foxconn believes that married women have more family responsibilities than their unmarried counterparts, which, according to the company, leads to issues. One former employee even claimed that one of the main problems are babies. Foxconn sources suggest that family duties, pregnancy, and higher absenteeism are the reasons why married women are not hired. Another reason is the jewelry that they wear, like metal toe rings or necklaces. Foxconn believes that it could interfere with the manufacturing process. Now, Indian law doesn't stop companies from discriminating in hiring based on marital status. But this is against Apple's policies. Ironically, it's against Foxconn's policies too. But this reluctance to hire married women is only when it suits the company. When there is a labor shortage, Foxconn actually does recruit them to meet manufacturing demands. Now, this is not the first time Foxconn has been accused of something like this. It's long-faced scrutiny over its work environment. In China, a spate of suicides by Foxconn employees raised questions. In India, protests broke out in the same plant in 2021 after the workers suffered food poisoning. But Foxconn is not the only company to be accused of such practices. Amazon is notorious for a toxic work environment. The company has pledged to create Earth's safest place to work. But it isn't willing to pay the bills for employees injured in its factories. Injured Amazon workers are starting GoFundMe pages to foot their medical bills. In India, reports suggest that Amazon workers have to take an oath to finish their task before they can take a toilet break. The situation is especially bad for female workers. They don't even have access to designated restroom facilities. This shows you the double standards of companies. They may claim to have the best hiring practices or the best work culture, but employees are being discriminated against on the basis of their marital status. And they're being penalized for taking toilet breaks.
For our last story tonight, let's talk about the one thing we all seem to have a love-hate relationship with exercising. According to a new study, this relationship is not working out, quite literally, because the world is not exercising enough. Nearly 1/3 of adults are physically unfit globally. That is approximately 1.8 billion people. While the numbers vary across nations, the picture is grim in India. According to data, half of the Indian population is physically inactive. Here's a report.
Picture this. You want to exercise regularly, so you set a goal. But when the moment comes to get moving, you don't. Instead, your mind comes up with all kinds of excuses. I'm too tired. It's too hot. I don't want to spend money on a gym membership. We've all been there. The excuses are plenty, but the result is singular. A new study is out, and it says that nearly 1/3 of adults the world over are physically unfit. That's approximately 1.8 billion people. But inactivity rates vary widely between countries. For instance, in the United Arab Emirates, 66% adults don't get enough physical activity. In Malawi, the figure is under 3%. In general, the highest rates of physical inactivity have been observed in the Asia-Pacific region and South Asia, followed by North Africa and West Asia. Meanwhile, Oceania has the least physical inactivity, followed by Sub-Saharan Africa and Europe. So there are variations across nations. But what about India? Half the Indian population doesn't get enough physical activity. What's more alarming is that the prevalence of inactivity has risen sharply in India, from 22% in 2000 to 33% in 2010 to 49% in 2022. If left unchecked, the number is expected to climb to 60% by 2030, meaning the risk of diseases would also increase dramatically, because exercise is like a magic pill. It lowers blood pressure, it reduces the risk of cancer, diabetes, strokes, heart attacks, and dementia. It helps us age better, it makes us happier and more hopeful. In whatever form and for however long, exercise makes our lives better. So, how much exercise is good enough? According to the World Health Organization, adults should spend at least 150 minutes every week doing moderate intensity physical activity. This includes walking, cycling, or even household chores, or at least 75 minutes of more vigorous exercise like running or playing a sport. For many, this is a tough ask, which is why we have a love-hate relationship with exercise. And this relationship is not working out because neither are we. So how can we change this? By taking our excuses to not exercise more seriously. Experts say that mental blocks should not be treated as excuses. This fuels self-criticism, which stops us from meeting our goals. Instead, looking at reasons to not exercise as genuine obstacles helps us devise a plan. It's a solution-oriented approach. For instance, if you don't think you have time to work out, try starting small. According to data, adults spend an average of 35 hours per week on social media. So clearly, we do have the time. Another reason can be that you don't want to spend money on a gym. In that case, remember, you don't need a gym to get fit. Try stretching exercises or aerobics like jumping jacks. Planks, push-ups, and squats don't require gym equipment as well. Then let's say it's too hot to work out, so trade your run for a swim. If it's too cold to exercise, try indoor activities like strengthening your core or doing yoga. There are many solutions, but no matter what you choose, find the fun in movement, because if you enjoy exercising, you'll stick with it.
And now it's time for Vantage shots, images that tell the story. Activists splash red paint on Spanish steps to protest against the murder of women. Britain's King Charles hosts a state banquet for the Emperor and Empress of Japan. And an Euro 2024 volunteer shows off balancing skills with 9 beers on his head. Finally, taking you back in history, the UN Charter was signed. It was by representatives of the 50 countries in San Francisco. It is the founding document of the United Nations. Leaving you on that note, Thank you for watching. See you tomorrow.
Questo sangue che scorre sono tutte le persone innocenti.
To provide for our shared security, a stable world for future generations.
What does an orchestra look like? Musicians seated with their instruments reading from music sheets, singers harmonizing with the melodies, and a conductor at the center orchestrating the performance. Typically, the image of a conductor is that of a man. However, 31-year-old Offense Pitse is breaking this stereotype. Hailing from Mabopane, South Africa, Pitse is the first black South African woman to own and lead her own orchestra. She produces shows that seamlessly blend classical music with the popular South African genre Amapiano. Pitse's love for music ignited early at the age of 12. With encouragement from her church pastor, she picked up her first instrument.
So at the time, the pastor of the church was like, listen, if you want to learn how to play an instrument, come on Tuesday. And then my mom dropped me off on Tuesday. I got taught how to play the C scale. And basically the rest was history. So it was a means to an end. Like we're always in church, I had to find something to do. And the evolution of that was my love for classical music, my love for choral and opera. And being someone who is very passionate about young people, I started my own youth choir.
By the time she was 25, Pitse had started her own youth choir. As it gained momentum, she expanded her vision. She approached classical musicians to form a 40-piece orchestra. Together, they reimagined classic songs by legendary artists. Despite never dreaming of a career in classical music, Pitse describes her journey as a gift. She leads her orchestra with passion, sensitivity, and authenticity. In 2023, Pitse led a 74-piece female orchestra in a rendition of Alicia Keys' If I Ain't Got You, alongside the Grammy Award-winning artist for Netflix's Queen Charlotte, a spin-off of the popular Bridgerton series.
But I would say, in terms of the greatest accomplishment in my career, it was the reimagination of If I Ain't Got You. With Alicia Keys, we had this 74-piece global female orchestra, right, from across the world. I mean, there were 2 women from Ghana, there was 1 from Senegal. And I think what was also important about that project was how woman-centered it is. So even behind the scenes, there was women there, right? The person printing the music, the person buying, even the arranger, Bobby Jane Gardner, is a woman.
From impeachments to inaugurations, if it's a political story, we are on the scene. The race for the White House is heating up.
We're beating Biden.
How dare he say that?
If it's breaking news, we're live with the latest coverage. From the White House, the State Department, and Capitol Hill. We know the issues, but above all, we know the players to bring you the latest in-depth analysis on all the key stories that we're covering. I'm Eric Ham. Join me from Washington here on First Post America.